So out of 6,668 refugees that were admitted into the United States under this one specific executive order recently, all but 3 came from one single country.
Right. And, we aren't talking about a nation that's currently being carpet bombed or anything like that.
No, exactly. We're not talking about a state in the middle of some recognized declared civil war. We are talking about a country that, just 30 years ago was universally celebrated as like the global poster child
Right.
for a peaceful democratic transition.
It's just a staggering data point when you look at Executive Order 14204, which was issued by former U.S. President Donald Trump, and you see that ratio, 6,665 out of 6,668 individuals.
Yeah.
You have to immediately ask, what kind of unseen centrifugal force is throwing people out of their homeland at that kind of velocity?
Okay, let's unpack this, because that question is exactly what we're diving into today. We are looking at South Africa, but we're looking at it through a highly specific, intensely provocative lens today.
Yeah, we have a really fascinating stack of source material for this one.
We really do. It's centered around a recent YouTube interview from the Winston Marshall channel. And he sits down with this South African entrepreneur and investor named Rob Hersov. So our mission for this deep dive is to map out Hersov's specific worldview regarding the past, the present, and the, deeply fractured future of his country.
But before we dive into the mechanics of his argument, we really need to establish a very clear baseline for you, the listener, because the material we're analyzing today is raw. It's highly controversial.
Oh, absolutely.
It contains politically charged viewpoints, touching on race, colonialism, severe systemic violence, and just the total collapse of governance.
Right. And it is vital to state right here at the top, we are not taking sides here.
Not at all.
We are not endorsing Hersov's views, and we aren't acting as his critics either. Think of us as your impartial navigators. We're just going to explore the architecture of his arguments, break down how he constructs his historical and political reality.
Exactly. We're just trying to understand exactly what he is trying to convey to the world. We are entirely focused on what's being argued in the provided text.
So where do we even begin with a text like this?
Well, to understand that architecture, you really have to start where he starts, because Hersov doesn't ease into his political analysis.
No, he really doesn't hold back.
He immediately drops the series of statistics designed to frame South Africa's current reality as this active, localized nightmare. So that refugee data you mentioned, that's just his opening salvo to prove that there is this profound existential threat driving the exodus.
Right.
And from there, he pivots directly into domestic crime.
And the numbers he throws out are just, they're chilling. He cites that there are 58 murders a day in South Africa.
Yeah, 58.
Every single day. He explicitly calls it the murder capital of the African continent. And he places it in the top 5 globally for murder rates per capita.
Which is wild.
It is. But where his argument gets incredibly granular and frankly really disturbing is when he narrows his focus to the agricultural sector.
Right. What's fascinating here is that the statistics regarding farm murders, they form the absolute emotional and political core of his current worldview.
Yeah, you can really tell how central this is to him.
He points out that while the raw numbers might have seen some slight fluctuations recently, the baseline reality for farmers is horrific. And he's careful to note that this includes both white and black farmers, though predominantly those running small to medium-sized operations.
Okay.
According to the data he presents, farmers are 3 times more likely to be murdered than the average South African citizen.
Wait, 3 times?
Yes.
Wow. And here's the comparison that really jolts you, too. They are twice as likely to be murdered as a police officer.
It's crazy to think about.
You are statistically in more danger growing corn or raising cattle than you are wearing a badge and patrolling the streets in a country with an apocalyptic crime rate.
Yeah.
And it's not just the frequency of the violence that he highlights, right?
Right.
It's the specific, performative nature of it.
Yes, exactly. The source details that 20% of these farm murders involve severe torture. And the examples given are just grim. We're talking about people being tied up with barbed wire, tortured with boiling pots of water, just horrific physical assaults that go far beyond a simple robbery.
Which is why there are such visceral public displays of mourning and protest associated with this specific demographic. Hersov mentions a planned vigil of 3,500 white crosses to be placed on the National Mall in Washington, D.C.
Right, yeah.
And each cross represents a murdered farmer and their family.
Mm.
And this isn't just some political stunt for an American audience, It's a direct reflection of an existing memorial in South Africa.
Oh, the hill outside Johannesburg.
Exactly.
Okay.
Near Johannesburg, there is a hill known in Afrikaans as Plaasmoordkapje, which just translates to Farm Murder Hill. And it is literally covered in kilometers of these white crosses. It's this massive physical manifestation of this specific targeted grief.
So this brings us to what's probably the most radioactive word in this entire discussion. The interviewer, Winston Marshall, asks him directly if this constitutes a genocide.
Right, he just puts it right out there.
He does. And Hersov makes a very specific, calculated semantic distinction. He says, and I quote, "Are South African farmers being pushed into crematoriums? No."
Right.
So he explicitly states it is not a genocide in the Holocaust sense of the word,
Yeah.
but he immediately reclassifies it as anti-white racist persecution.
And he doesn't just use that phrase casually, right? Like, he tries to build a legalistic framework around it.
He does, yeah. He references the United Nations official definition of genocide. He basically argues that while the final absolute act of mass industrialized extermination isn't happening, about 7 of the 10 elements defined by the UN are actively present in South Africa today. Wow.
He lists identification, racial classification, persecution, and denial as elements that are occurring systematically. So he is stopping just short of the G word, but he's demanding that the international community view this violence through the lens of targeted persecution, rather than just random criminality.
But, this is where we have to pause and look at the underlying mechanics of this violence. Because if you have a country with massive historic wealth disparity, soaring unemployment, and a struggling economy, how do you separate raw economic desperation from pure racial animosity?
That's a great question.
I mean, if a farm is isolated and holds valuable assets, vehicles, cash, firearms, isn't it naturally just a target for organized crime? It feels like looking at a powder keg. Is the spark coming from the crushing poverty, or is the spark coming from political rhetoric? Because even Hersov acknowledges that a portion of these attacks are economically driven.
Yeah, that is the central tension of his thesis. He doesn't deny the economic realities of South Africa, not at all. But he argues that economics alone cannot explain the sheer theatrical brutality of the attacks because of the torture.
Exactly. A simple robbery doesn't require boiling water or barbed wire. A simple robbery doesn't involve spending hours torturing a family before taking their car. Hersov argues that this extra layer of violence, the cruelty for the sake of cruelty, is the direct result of a political spark.
And he names that spark directly.
He absolutely does. He points squarely at Julius Malema, the leader of the Economic Freedom Fighters, or the EFF party.
Right.
Hersov claims there is a measurable direct correlation between political rhetoric and rural violence. He argues that when Malema and his supporters fill stadiums and chant, "Kill the Boer, kill the farmer," which, by the way, is a historical anti-apartheid song that Malema has revived, it acts as an accelerant.
Right.
He quotes Malema as saying they will slit the throat of whiteness, but not yet. So to Hersov, this is not abstract political theater or, harmless historical chanting. He views it as a direct causal incitement that translates into bloodshed on those isolated farms.
And his frustration really seems to stem from the fact that the ruling party, the ANC, refuses to classify these chants as hate speech, which in his view essentially gives this rhetoric a state-sanctioned pass.
Right.
So we're presented with this incredibly dark picture of the present, a society fraying at the edges, terrified farmers, and a murder rate that defies logic. But the source material then does this whiplash-inducing pivot to the past.
Yeah, it really jumps back.
It asks the obvious question: how did the nation of Nelson Mandela end up here?
Well, to map that out, Hersov divides the post-apartheid history of South Africa into very distinct, almost geological eras. And he starts with a period he clearly reveres, the 10 years following the end of apartheid in 1994. He calls this the Golden Era.
The Golden Era, yeah.
This was the time of the Rainbow Nation under Nelson Mandela. And it's actually fascinating to hear a hard-nosed, cynical investor speak with such genuine emotion about this period. He genuinely believes that for a decade, the people of South Africa bought into a collective vision of putting the past behind them to build a functional, multiracial democracy.
He even brings up that one moment that everyone globally remembers, the 1995 Rugby World Cup.
Oh, such an iconic moment.
Right. You have Nelson Mandela walking out onto the pitch wearing the green and gold Springbok jersey, which for decades was a symbol of Afrikaner nationalism, and handing the championship trophy to the white Afrikaner captain, Francois Pienaar.
Yeah.
Hersov says that moment still gives him shivers down his spine. He claims that even the most hardened right-wing Afrikaners watched that happen and felt their hearts break in the best way possible. It was this massive collective exhale.
And beyond just the powerful symbolism, Hersov praises Mandela's actual policy decisions. He credits Mandela with actively holding back what he describes as the evil, socialist, left-wing Soviet policies that were, deeply baked into the ANC's long-term ideological DNA.
So he kept the economy open.
Exactly. Instead of immediate radical wealth redistribution or state control, Mandela favored building a meritocracy. And importantly, Hersov notes that this stability and growth continued under Mandela's successor, Thabo Mbeki. He points out that under Mbeki, between roughly 1998 and 2006, the South African economy was actually growing at a very healthy 3 to 4% annually.
Right. He mentions that while Black Economic Empowerment Programs, BEE, were implemented during this time, they were initially sensible. They were viewed as necessary, manageable corrections rather than punitive extractions. Like, things were working, the trajectory was up.
But then, according to his timeline, the nation hit a brick wall. He marks the year 2008 and the rise of Jacob Zuma to the presidency as the absolute turning point.
Yeah, the tone shifts dramatically here.
Oh, Hersov does not mince words. He describes the Zuma era as the moment when pure evil entered the game.
Okay, we need to spend some real time here because this is where the transcript moves from just standard political disagreement to describing the systemic dismantling of a nation-state. He introduces the concept of state capture.
Yes.
Now, that phrase gets thrown around a lot in global politics, usually just as a synonym for intense lobbying or, bad corruption. But Hersov is describing something much more mechanical.
Much more.
He claims this wasn't just greed, it was a classic Soviet doctrine, one he alleges Zuma was trained in while exiled in Soviet Russia during the apartheid years.
Exactly. We really have to unpack the mechanics of state capture because it's the engine of South Africa's current dysfunction, according to this worldview.
Yeah.
I mean, standard corruption is a politician skimming 10% off the top of a road building contract, right?
Sure.
The road still gets built, it just costs the taxpayer more. State capture is entirely different. It is the systematic, deliberate takeover of the commanding heights of the economy and the state apparatus. It is the literal hostile takeover of the institutions themselves.
So how does that actually work on a Tuesday?
Right.
Like, what does that look like in a standard government office?
So it operates through a mechanism called cadre deployment. The ruling party identifies every lever of power and every pool of state resources, from the national airline all the way down to the municipal water boards. Then they systematically remove the competent professionals running those institutions.
Just push them out.
Yeah. Hersov points out that many of these professionals were white, but he insists the critical issue was their competence, their institutional memory. They are fired, pushed out, or forced into early retirement.
And who replaces them?
A cadre. A party loyalist, someone whose primary qualification is their absolute loyalty to the political faction in power, not their ability to actually execute the job. Hersov claims these replacements often possessed zero relevant education and zero competence for the highly technical roles they were given.
Okay, let's ground this in reality for the listener. Imagine the person running the water treatment plant in your city. They know the flow rates, they know the chemical balances, they know which aging pipe needs replacing before winter. Under cadre deployment, that engineer is removed. In their place, the party installs someone whose only background might be, organizing political rallies.
Exactly. Now, take that municipal example and scale it up to an entire nation's vital infrastructure. When you put a political loyalist in charge of a massive state-owned enterprise, they don't view the maintenance budget as capital required to keep the machines running.
What do they view it as?
They view the maintenance budget as a slush fund. It basically becomes a pool of money to be extracted, either through direct theft or by handing out wildly inflated contracts to front companies owned by their friends and political allies.
And the fallout of this strategy, as detailed by Hersov, is nothing short of catastrophic. I mean, he lists the bankruptcy of essentially every major state-owned enterprise in the country.
It's a long list.
Let's look at South African Airways, SAA. He notes that it used to be the premier airline on the continent, flying hundreds of routes globally. But under state capture, it was handed over to a woman named Dudu Myeni. And Hersov describes her as a failed schoolteacher with zero experience in aviation or corporate logistics.
And the mechanism of failure there is entirely predictable. When leadership doesn't understand the intricacies of aircraft leasing or fuel hedging or route profitability, and when procurement becomes a mechanism for patronage rather than efficiency, an airline bleeds cash at an astonishing rate.
Yeah.
And SAA went bankrupt. It was shredded.
Then there is Eskom, the national electricity provider. This is the heart of the modern economy. And we aren't just talking about financial bankruptcy here. We are talking about the physical degradation of the grid itself.
Right.
It resulted in a decade of what South Africans call load shedding, which is scheduled daily rolling blackouts across the entire nation because the power plants literally could not generate enough electricity.
And the list just goes on. Transnet, the massive national rail and port network, bankrupt. When you don't maintain the rail lines because the money was siphoned off, trains physically derail, the ports clog up, you can't export your minerals, the post office, bankrupt. Denel, their once highly respected military and aerospace export business, bankrupt.
And at the absolute center of this web, pulling the strings of state capture, Hersov places the Gupta family.
Yes, the Guptas.
These were three brothers from India who immigrated to South Africa in the 1990s. They started in retail and IT, but eventually became incredibly close confidants of Jacob Zuma. The source material alleges that they essentially operated as a shadow state, dictating cabinet appointments and state contracts, and stealing billions of rand in the process.
Yeah.
Hersov goes so far as to refer to the ANC during this period not as a political party, but as a mafia organization that used the mechanisms of democracy to facilitate grand theft.
And when you combine the looting of state capture with the sheer incompetence of cadre deployment, you get the overarching economic reality that Hersov presents next. He states that for the last 10 years, the South African economy has grown at perhaps 1% a year. Meanwhile, the population is growing at 1.5% a year.
The math on that is brutal. If the pie is barely growing, but the number of people eating the pie is growing faster, the average slice gets smaller every single day. The nation is mathematically going backward. He claims that since 2007, the actual real wealth level of the country hasn't grown at all.
Which brings us to the inevitable logical question. If you are a citizen living through this, if your power goes out every day, if your water is unreliable, if the trains don't run, and if violent crime is off the charts, how do you vote?
You vote them out, right?
You would assume the ruling party would be utterly decimated at the polls. And this leads directly into Hersov's analysis of the political landscape, particularly the seismic shifts of the 2024 national election.
And on the surface, the 2024 election looks like exactly that kind of reckoning. For the first time in 30 years, since the dawn of the Democratic era, the ANC dropped below the 50% majority mark.
Huge moment.
Yeah, they didn't just barely lose it, they fell from roughly 56% down to 40%. A massive rebuke.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where Hersov's analysis becomes deeply pessimistic. Because losing a majority doesn't necessarily mean the electorate has suddenly embraced his preferred vision of centrist free market governance.
Right.
The ANC lost its absolute grip, but the vote fractured in ways that actually terrify him.
Exactly. We have to look at who actually picked up all those lost ANC votes. It wasn't the moderate opposition. A massive chunk of it went to Jacob Zuma.
The same guy.
The very same man Hersov blames for initiating the entire era of state capture. After being ousted from the ANC, Zuma started a brand new political party called MK, which stands for Umkhonto weSizwe, or the Spear of the Nation. This was the name of the old armed military wing of the ANC during apartheid. He co-opted that powerful historical branding. And in just 6 months, this brand new party captured 15% of the national vote.
It is a stunning political resurrection. Hersov describes Zuma as a complete gangster, utterly corrupt, but he concedes that Zuma possesses immense political charisma.
He really does.
He likens him to a grandfather handing out presents. Zuma understands populism, he understands patronage networks, and he speaks directly to the grievances of his base, particularly in his home province of KwaZulu-Natal.
And then you have the EFF, led by Julius Malema, who we discussed earlier in relation to the farm murder rhetoric. They captured about 8% of the vote.
So Hersov does the political arithmetic here. Right. You have the ANC at 40%, MK at 15%, and the EFF at 8%. He looks at that block and concludes that over 60% of the voting public is still actively choosing what he describes as deranged, leftist, hard left, or quasi-communist parties.
Yeah.
He doesn't see a nation waking up and choosing a new path. He sees an electorate migrating from a failing left-wing monopoly toward even more radical, fragmented left-wing options.
But he does acknowledge the existence of a substantial opposition. He points to the DA, the Democratic Alliance, which is currently sitting at around 22% of the national vote. Hersov highlights that the DA already runs the Western Cape province, which includes Cape Town.
And he loves Cape Town.
Oh, who does? He notes that under DA governance, the contrast is stark. The infrastructure works, there are no potholes, the finances are relatively clean, and foreign investment still flows in. He categorizes them as a center-right party, though he notes they prefer to view themselves as center-liberal. His projection for the DA is cautious, though. He thinks they will slowly, incrementally grow, perhaps picking up some disillusioned centrist voters from the ANC, while simultaneously bleeding a few conservative voters to parties further to the right, like the Freedom Front Plus.
Right.
But his overall timeline is grim. He believes the needle of democracy moves agonizingly slowly. He predicts immense economic and social pain between now and the next national elections in 2029, which is the date he boldly predicts the ANC will finally cease to exist as a coherent political force.
Now, amidst this heavy structural political analysis, the source material introduces an anecdote that is just absolutely incredible.
Yes.
It highlights the wild unpredictability of this political fracture. Hersov talks about a specific politician he strongly supports named Gayton McKenzie.
I'm so glad we're pausing on this because Gayton McKenzie's biography reads like a movie script.
It really does.
McKenzie is currently sitting in the National Cabinet as the Minister of Sports, Arts, and Culture. But his background is not in law or civil service. Before he was a minister, he spent 8 years in a maximum security prison.
Wow.
He was the head of the infamous 26 Gang, a massive, highly organized criminal syndicate within the prison system. In fact, McKenzie openly brags in public speeches that he was the most wanted, most successful bank robber in the history of South Africa.
It is a level of political transparency you almost never see anywhere in the world.
Right. He isn't hiding it at all. He transformed himself while incarcerated, got out, became a highly successful entrepreneur, a motivational speaker, and then built his own political party. Hersov talks about how McKenzie has traveled to Singapore to study how they implement the death penalty.
Right.
He's met with Nayib Bukele in El Salvador to discuss crushing gang violence. He's met with Javier Milei in Argentina to discuss radical economic deregulation.
Yeah.
And Hersov, this wealthy elite investor, looks at this former bank-robbing gang boss and calls him one of the most extraordinary humans he's ever met, even suggesting he should be running the entire country.
What this anecdote really reveals is the profound appetite for disruption. When the traditional state apparatus has failed so completely, the electorate and even the elite business class like Hersov begins to look for strongmen.
Definitely.
They look for figures who operate completely outside the paralyzed norms of traditional bureaucracy. A former bank robber who promises to govern with ruthless, pragmatic efficiency suddenly becomes a highly attractive option.
It totally shifts the paradigm. When I was reading this section, looking at the ANC breaking apart, the rise of Zuma's MK, Malema's EFF, the DA in the Cape, and wildcard populists like McKenzie, the best analogy I could think of is a massive corporate unbundling.
Oh, how do you mean?
Well, for 30 years, the ANC was this giant, monolithic central monopoly. They ran the entire marketplace of South African politics. But now, because of gross mismanagement, that monopoly is bleeding market share rapidly.
Yeah.
It is breaking apart. Right.
But the new political startups that are capturing that lost market share, MK, the DA, the EFF, they don't just have slightly different product offerings. They have radically, fundamentally different business models for how the entire nation state should operate.
That is a very apt way to describe it.
The DA wants a federalized, decentralized, free market model. The EFF wants absolute state control, nationalization of banks, and expropriation of land. MK wants a blend of populist patronage and traditional leadership. It is a complete fracture of the national vision. There's no longer a shared idea of what South Africa is supposed to be.
And that profound fracture is exactly why Hersov so aggressively advocates for decentralization. He explicitly argues that a country this complex, with this much internal contradiction, simply cannot be run from a centralized government in Pretoria anymore.
Yeah, he's done with Pretoria. He openly talks about the need for federalization and even flirts with the idea of secession. He points out that the Western Cape, under DA control, operates so fundamentally differently from the rest of the country that it almost shouldn't be connected to the failing national grid.
Which naturally begs the question. If the political solutions are moving at a glacial pace, and the central government is viewed as either deeply incompetent or actively malicious, how are people actually surviving?
Yeah.
Like, how do you run a business, raise a family, or just exist day to day in this environment? This is where the source material paints a picture of a society that is essentially split into two different realities. The phrase Hersov uses to describe it is straight out of a dystopian film. He calls it living in Mad Max.
He uses that phrase to capture the extreme, jarring juxtaposition of daily life. He describes South Africa as a place of absolute extremes. On one hand, he says if you have money, it is literal paradise on earth. Yeah. You have access to an incredibly high standard of living at a fraction of the cost of Europe or the US because the local currency, the rand, is so weak. You have access to world-class private medical and dental care, stunning geography, perfect weather, and you live in these wealthy enclaves like Cape Town, which he insists is the greatest city on the planet.
Right, but the caveat is massive.
Right.
He immediately follows that up by saying, but if you don't have money, it's hell.
It's hell.
And he is remarkably candid about his own privilege here. He admits that he and his wealthy peers live inside literal physical bubbles. They live in heavily fortified gated communities. Every single road entering their neighborhoods is covered by high-definition security cameras and license plate readers.
Unbelievable.
They have private, heavily armed response teams on speed dial. He mentions that he has systematically de-risked his entire life. His primary wealth is structured overseas. His children are educated overseas. He holds a British passport. He can enjoy the paradise of South Africa precisely because he is financially insulated from the hell.
And that intense level of physical insulation isn't a luxury. It is a necessity driven by the complete collapse of state security. Earlier, we discussed the bankruptcy of the state arms manufacturer, Denel. But the decay extends entirely through the actual military and police forces.
The actual military.
Yes, they were described as hollowed-out shells. Hersov, who notes that he served in the South African Army in the 1980s during the border wars when he claims it was a globally feared, unbeatable force, says today's military is pathetic. He claims the fighter jets don't fly because there is no maintenance budget. The helicopters are unserviceable, they possess 3 submarines, and none of them are operational.
Wow. And the domestic police force. He's even more scathing there. He describes them as corrupt to the core, completely demoralized, and terrified.
Terrified of the criminals.
Exactly. He shares an anecdote about speaking with a friend who's a senior police officer. The officer told Hersov that he, as a private citizen, legally possesses more ammunition in his personal gun safe than the entire local municipal police station has in its armory.
That's insane!
Right. He claims the average police officer only goes to the firing range once a year to shoot at a stationary paper target, and that the cops are genuinely more afraid of the heavily armed criminal syndicates than the citizens are.
The mechanical result of this state failure leads to one of the most astonishing statistics in the entire deep dive. Because the state can no longer guarantee the safety of its citizens, the free market has stepped in.
The free market of force.
Exactly. There are currently more armed private security guards operating in South Africa than there are active duty soldiers in the National Army and police officers combined. Let me repeat that. The private sector now holds the dominant monopoly on armed force in the country.
It is the ultimate privatization of the state. If you call 1111, which is their equivalent of 911, you might wait hours for a police car with no gas. If you press the panic button on your private security app, 2 armored SUVs full of ex-military contractors show up in 3 minutes.
Wow.
And when you have a state that cannot or will not protect its citizens, you inevitably get flashpoints like the July 2021 unrest.
The source material spends significant time on this event because it perfectly illustrates the Mad Max reality. In July 2021, triggered initially by the imprisonment of Jacob Zuma, massive coordinated riots erupted across the province of KwaZulu-Natal and parts of Johannesburg. It wasn't just protesting, it was the orchestrated, systemic looting and burning of critical infrastructure.
Basically tearing the place apart.
Massive distribution warehouses, shopping malls, and transport hubs essentially went up in flames.
And what was the response from the National Army and the police?
According to Hersov, and corroborated by many reports at the time, they essentially stood back. They were completely overwhelmed, outmanned, and in some cases, reportedly complicit or just too terrified to intervene. The state evaporated.
But the civilians didn't. And this is where Hersov's narrative finds this incredible glimmer of profound pride in his countrymen. He describes how, when the state vanished, everyday people stepped immediately into the void. It wasn't just the wealthy in their gated communities.
No, it was everyone.
He describes Indian shopkeepers, colored taxi drivers, white shopping mall owners, black community leaders, people across every conceivable racial and economic line, arming themselves with whatever they had. Shotguns, handguns, spears, cricket bats.
Wow.
They stood shoulder to shoulder at the entrances to their neighborhoods and shopping centers, and they formed localized, multiracial militias out of sheer, absolute necessity. And they held the line. They stopped the unrest in their specific areas when the government could not.
It is an undeniable image of deep societal resilience, but it's also deeply alarming. When citizens have to form armed militias to protect a grocery store, you are looking at a state that is teetering on the absolute edge of failure.
And Hersov uses this dark, self-deprecating humor to explain the psychology of living in this environment. He talks about his wife, who is from New Zealand, and he uses this brilliant analogy. He compares New Zealand to the Shire from Lord of the Rings. Yeah, it is idyllic, it is green, it's where the hobbits live. There are no natural predators, no systemic threats. The worst thing that makes the local news is someone falling out of a kayak.
Right. And then he compares South Africa to living on the very edge of Mordor. He acknowledges that it is incredibly dangerous, pointing back to the 58 murders a day, but he argues, almost perversely, that there is nothing more exciting.
He likes the
He claims that this constant proximity to danger, this friction, produces incredible resilience, great art, deep culture, and a profound appreciation for life that you simply don't find in the safety of the Shire.
which is a very romantic, swashbuckling way to view a collapsing nation-state if you happen to live in the heavily fortified, wealthy Shire part of Mordor.
Fair point.
But it begs a massive economic question. How do you actually do business in Mordor? How do you invest millions of dollars in a country where the power grid is failing and the police don't have bullets? Your expertise is in these macroeconomic mechanics. Break down Hersov's investment thesis for us, because it's fascinating precisely because it assumes the government is entirely useless.
His investment strategy is a masterclass in bypassing the state. He is incredibly blunt about this. He explicitly states that he will not invest in or build any business that requires government partnership, government contracts, or reliance on municipal infrastructure.
He just ignores them completely.
He views the state purely as a liability. Instead, his entire thesis is built on arbitrage. He looks for opportunities where he can leverage cheap South African input costs, labor, land, and stranded assets, made cheap because the rand is so weak, and pair them exclusively with US dollar revenue streams.
And he gives a massive, highly specific example of this happening right now. He is deeply involved in a 2-gigawatt infrastructure project building AI hyperscale compute data centers. Now, on the surface, that sounds insane. How on earth do you guarantee power for a massive AI data center in a country famous worldwide for rolling blackouts?
Well, this is where the mechanics are brilliant. You don't build on the national grid. You go to the dying, deindustrializing sectors of the old economy. Hersov explains that they are targeting massive sunsetting industrial facilities, old aluminum smelters, and heavy manufacturing plants that had massive historic power contracts with Eskom but are now going out of business. They take over those sites, clean out the old industrial machinery, digitize the infrastructure, and reroute those incredibly cheap, dedicated electrons directly into AI processing units.
The mechanics are, you buy the stranded power to South African rand prices, you use it to run the logic gates for global AI models, and you sell that compute power to tech companies in Silicon Valley for US dollars. He calls it the deal of the century.
Exactly. He is extracting the raw energy of a dying industrial sector and monetizing it globally, entirely bypassing the local economic collapse.
But this is where I have to throw a flag and push back hard on his entire worldview. I hear the brilliance of the arbitrage, but is this a sustainable model for a nation-state?
Well,
Let's zoom out. You have an elite, globally connected class building literal high-tech AI enclaves, earning massive US dollar revenues, protecting themselves with heavily armed private security armies, operating inside the hollowed-out shell of a deindustrializing country where the vast majority of the population is living in a Mad Max reality without basic municipal water or safety. Hersov might call that resilience, but that sounds less like a functioning country and more like a corporate extraction zone.
Hersov would likely counter that argument by saying it is the only sustainable model left available to him. He isn't trying to save the concept of the South African nation-state. His actions suggest he views the centralized state as dead weight, a parasitic entity.
Just trying to survive it.
He is building parallel systems because the primary system has failed. But you are absolutely right to point out the profound disconnect, and to understand why these stark racial and economic divides exist, and why this deep mistrust of the state is so prevalent. The source material takes us on a deep and frankly highly controversial dive into the region's history. Hersov deeply believes that how you interpret the history of South Africa dictates how you view the current legitimacy of the state and its various people.
And I want to jump in with a quick reminder to you, the listener, right here. We are now entering into Hersov's very specific, very personal historical interpretations. We are examining how he uses history to justify his current political and economic positions. We are outlining his arguments, not validating this history as absolute objective fact.
That framing is crucial because Hersov's view of colonialism is unapologetic and central to his identity. He offers a very robust, aggressive defense of British colonialism in Africa, and he does so by contrasting it sharply with other European colonial powers to establish a hierarchy of imperialism. He argues that while the Portuguese were in Angola and Mozambique for 600 years, and in his words, barely built a highway, and while the Belgians raped and pillaged beyond belief under King Leopold in the Congo, the British project was fundamentally different.
He claims the British were superb administrators. He focuses heavily on infrastructure and institutions. He says the British built the roads, created the legal structures, and most importantly, implemented robust education systems.
He points to Zimbabwe a lot.
He points across the border to modern Zimbabwe as his prime evidence. He claims that despite the total economic ruin and the violent expulsion of white farmers under Robert Mugabe's regime, Zimbabweans remain some of the most highly educated and literate people on the African continent today, entirely because of the deep foundation laid by the British education system a century ago.
This defense of the imperial project extends to specific historical figures, most notably Cecil John Rhodes. Now, globally, Rhodes is widely considered a deeply controversial arch-imperialist figure, the architect of policies that laid the groundwork for apartheid. The interviewer, Marshall, asks Hersov point blank, was Rhodes a visionary or a colonialist racist?
And Hersov's answer is a very blunt both. He doesn't shy away from it. He acknowledges that Rhodes was a racist, that he was a hardcore colonialist, and that he was utterly ruthless in his business and political dealings.
Yeah.
But he immediately pivots to call him a heroic, extraordinary visionary. He credits Rhodes with almost single-handedly driving the modernization of Southern Africa, building the vast rail networks, creating massive global mining conglomerates like De Beers and Anglo-American that generated immense wealth, and establishing enduring institutions like the Rhodes Scholarship.
When pressed on how he reconciles the undeniable racism of these historical figures, Hersov utilizes a very specific analytical lens. He relies heavily on the concept of historical relativism, actively pushing back against what historians call presentism, the idea of judging past actors by modern 21st century moral standards.
He poses a hypothetical question to make his point. He asks, if he, as a highly educated, technologically advanced European, had arrived on ships with the Dutch in 1650 or with the British in 1820 and encountered local indigenous tribes who were, as he describes them, agrarian cattle herders without the written word or the wheel, would he have treated them as absolute equals?
And his answer to his own question is a blunt, of course not. He says he would have viewed them as children of a lesser god. He argues that he would have naturally adopted a highly paternalistic, dominant approach because, in his view, the arriving Europeans and the local tribes were separated by hundreds of years of technological and institutional development.
He is essentially arguing that racism, in that very specific historical context of first contact, wasn't born of inherent malice, but was an inevitable byproduct of the vast, undeniable technological and societal asymmetry of the era.
Right.
However, and this is a massive, however, in his argument, he explicitly states that he feels entirely differently now. He says that today, racism is a pigment of the imagination. He argues fiercely that there was absolutely nothing genetic about intelligence, capability, or ambition.
Yeah, he makes that very clear.
He believes that with equal access to education, nutrition, and care, anyone from any background can be globally competitive. He frequently cites his close friend, the Zimbabwean billionaire telecom magnate Strive Masiyiwa, as living proof of this reality.
So he compartmentalizes the history. He excuses the historical racism as contextual while claiming modern egalitarianism. But this historical reframing gets even more intense and even more specific when the conversation turns away from the British relationship with Black Africans and focuses on the British relationship with the Afrikaners during the Boer War.
Oh boy.
The interviewer brings up a biography of Lord Kitchener by Philip Magnus, noting a common anti-colonial talking point, that the British actually invented the modern concentration camp during their brutal war against the Boers in South Africa.
Or Hersov immediately jumps in, and much like he did with the word genocide earlier, he makes a fierce semantic distinction. He says you cannot, under any circumstances, compare these British camps to Nazi death camps, specifically stating there were no ovens and no industrialized extermination machinery.
Right.
He then provides a highly detailed, strategic military justification for why the camps were created in the first place.
He explains the military mechanics of the Boer War. He points out that the British were fighting a conventional war, but the Boer army wasn't a traditional standing, uniformed army. They were highly mobile, volunteer civilian farmers on horseback.
Guerrilla fighters.
Exactly. They knew the terrain perfectly, they were incredible marksmen, and they fought a brilliant guerrilla campaign. They would attack British columns, inflict heavy casualties, and then melt away back into the vast countryside, returning to their isolated farms to resupply with food and horses. They were impossible for a conventional army to pin down and defeat.
So, according to Hersov's telling, the British military command realized the only way to win the war was to destroy the guerrilla supply lines. They initiated a ruthless, scorched earth policy, systematically burning down thousands of Boer farms, destroying crops, and slaughtering livestock.
Brutal stuff.
But this brutal military tactic created a massive, immediate logistical crisis. What do you do with the tens of thousands of Boer women and children who are suddenly left homeless and starving on the scorched veldt? The British military solution was to round them up and move them into tented camps.
And here is the absolute core of his historical argument regarding the camps. He fully acknowledges the horror. He acknowledges that staggering numbers of Boer women and children died in these camps. Tens of thousands perished from dysentery, typhoid, and starvation.
Yeah.
But he insists vehemently that this was not by design. It was not a deliberate, malicious genocide aimed at wiping out the Boer population. It was, in his words, a poorly executed strategy. It was an unintentional, catastrophic failure of wartime logistics. The British simply couldn't transport enough clean water and food to the camps, disease broke out, and the people died. He views it as a tragic military blunder of the highest order, but absolutely not a deliberate extermination program.
Okay, let me jump in here because we have spent a lot of time in the 19th century, and I have to ask the obvious question. Why does a modern tech investing entrepreneur, a guy building AI data centers, spend so much time and emotional energy fiercely litigating the logistics of the Boer War and the nuances of Cecil Rhodes?
That is the million-dollar question.
Is this just a hobbyist academic debate? Or is he doing something much more calculated?
It is entirely calculated.
So what does this all mean? By arguing that the British brought essential civilization and infrastructure, and by arguing that the immense suffering of the Boers was a shared, tragic consequence of war rather than a one-sided colonial oppression, is he essentially asserting his own contemporary claim to the land?
I think so.
He explicitly tells the interviewer at one point, "I am an African. I am not a colonialist." He proudly identifies as a fourth-generation South African. He's actively using this specific interpretation of history to anchor his right to exist, to own property, and to thrive in that space today, pushing back against the narrative that he is merely the descendant of illegitimate European settlers.
That is precisely the psychological and political utility of his historical narrative. He is constructing a robust framework where his presence and the presence of his ancestors is not an imposition on the continent, but rather a foundational, irreplaceable element of the nation's modernization. And this historical framing leads directly into how he views the current cultural landscape of South Africa, particularly regarding race, modern social movements, and the psychological resilience of the people who have chosen to stay.
Which brings us to the culture war aspect of the interview, which provides a really fascinating juxtaposition with the West. The interviewer, Winston Marshall, shares an anecdote about visiting South Africa right before the global pandemic.
Oh, the jazz club story?
Yes. He says he went to a jazz club in a major city. He was the only white guy in the room, and he noticed a poet performing on stage. And the audience, instead of clapping their hands to applaud, was snapping their fingers.
Okay.
Marshall, coming from the UK and the US, recognized this immediately. He identified it as a very specific, woke, progressive American college campus behavior, originally designed to be accommodating to people with sensory processing issues by not being aggressively loud. He was shocked to see this hyper-specific American cultural export happening in a South African jazz club.
And Hersov's reaction to this anecdote is incredibly telling of his worldview. He essentially dismisses it entirely. He claims that wokeism, as a broad cultural and political movement, has utterly failed to take root in South Africa outside of very small, highly insulated bubbles.
Just a fringe thing.
He identifies those bubbles specifically as the white, wealthy intelligentsia, elite university campuses, and certain left-leaning media houses.
He is adamant about this. He says the general working-class population of South Africa couldn't give a damn about American culture war issues. He asserts that the vast, overwhelming majority of South Africans across all racial lines, and he specifically includes the vast majority of Black South Africans in this play, are fundamentally conservative in their worldview.
Right.
He describes them as Christian, capitalist, slow-moving in a positive, deliberate way, church-going, family-oriented, and simply trying to work hard and make their way in a difficult life.
This raises an important question, though, because it points to a massive, glaring cognitive dissonance in Hersov's own political framework.
Yes. I was hoping we would circle back to this because the math does not make sense.
Exactly. Think back to his breakdown of the 2024 election just a few minutes ago. He spent a significant portion of the interview bemoaning the fact that 60% of the electorate continues to vote for what he explicitly calls deranged leftist, hard left, quasi-communist parties like the ANC and the EFF.
Right.
Parties that advocate for massive state intervention and wealth redistribution. But here, in the cultural discussion, he claims the vast majority of the exact same population is inherently conservative and capitalist. When the interviewer presses him on this obvious contradiction, Hersov waves it away. He dismisses the communist leanings of these political parties as just a brand or a form of childish political play acting. He insists the voters don't really believe in the Marxist ideology they're voting for.
It feels like a massive analytical blind spot. You can't credibly claim a nation's soul is inherently capitalist when the majority of its citizens consistently, for 3 decades, vote for parties whose foundational documents advocate for the nationalization of banks and the state control of land.
Yeah, you can't just ignore that.
But I think I understand why he does it. If you look at voter behavior in collapsing economies globally, voters don't usually vote for abstract economic ideology. They vote for patronage networks. They vote for the party that might deliver a bag of groceries, a temporary job, or a small social grant when the private sector has vanished. Hersov interprets this survival voting as a rejection of capitalism when it might just be raw desperation. But he clings fiercely to this idea of an inherent, shared conservative resilience. And he links this modern resilience directly back to the historical survival of the Afrikaners.
He circles back to the aftermath of the Boer War we unpacked earlier. He notes that after the war, the Afrikaner population was decimated. Their farms were burned to ash, their generational wealth was completely destroyed, and they lived in abject poverty for 20 years. But, he notes, they rebuilt. And they didn't rebuild through government assistance. They did it through a deeply ingrained cultural concept called help mekaar.
Help mekaar, which translates roughly to helping each other.
Exactly. It was a system of mutual aid. The poorest farmers pooled their tiny amounts of remaining capital. They formed mutual aid societies, which eventually grew into massive financial institutions. They built trade unions, they funded their own businesses, and they built their own universities. They pulled themselves out of poverty by relying entirely on their collective insular community.
When I look at that historical concept of help mekaar, it feels like the exact same social mechanism driving modern South Africans today. We talked earlier about the citizens standing shoulder to shoulder with shotguns during the riots to protect the malls. We talked about wealthy neighborhoods building their own private solar grids and hiring private security armies.
That's the exact same thing?
It is modern mutual aid. It is communities, both rich and poor, realizing the central state is not coming to save them, so they have to help each other survive. It is a 19th century survival mechanism playing out in real time in the 21st century.
However, the source material is clear that not everyone is choosing to stay and employ that survival mechanism. Hersov highlights a massive ongoing exodus. He notes that over 1 million South Africans, predominantly highly educated and predominantly white, have permanently left the country since the dawn of democracy in 1994. They have packed up their engineering degrees, their medical licenses, and their capital, and they have moved to London, Sydney, or the United States.
Which leads to a surprisingly funny, revealing anecdote about the absolute most famous of those expats, Elon Musk.
All this story's great.
The interviewer asks Hersov if South Africans back home still claim Musk as one of their own, considering he left decades ago. And Hersov laughs and says yes, absolutely. He says South Africans will claim anyone with even a tenuous connection, joking that they claim Roger Federer just because his mother happens to be South African. But then Hersov shares a story about getting a very rare 20-minute private lunch meeting with Musk at SpaceX headquarters about a decade ago.
He says they sit down and they chat intensely for 18 minutes. And as the clock is running out with 2 minutes left, Hersov looks at Musk and asks a simple networking question. How can I help you?
And Musk's reaction is brilliant. He looks at Hersov weirdly, pauses, and says, "Nobody has ever asked me that question."
Wow.
Musk then tells Hersov that because he is a billionaire surrounded by sycophants and yes men, what he really needs is someone to tell him when he is making a mistake.
Mm.
He asks Hersov to promise to give him critical, honest feedback if he ever sees him doing anything stupid in the media.
And the punchline of the story is that years later, when Musk notoriously smoked weed on the Joe Rogan podcast, causing Tesla stock to temporarily dive, Hersov remembered the promise. He texted Musk to say, hey, that wasn't cool, you shouldn't have done that. And
Oh.
Musk, predictably, completely ignored the text.
It's a great story, but it also perfectly highlights the global reach and the lingering connection of the South African diaspora. You have these incredibly successful people operating at the absolute highest levels of global technology and finance, who are still deeply connected culturally to their homeland, but who choose to operate globally because the domestic environment back home is simply too hostile to capital and innovation.
And that hostility to capital isn't just a byproduct of crime or bad infrastructure. It is actively being codified into law. Hersov points to what he views as the ultimate, looming existential threat to the nation's future. He mentions a constitutional amendment and policy framework being pushed by President Cyril Ramaphosa, known as expropriation without compensation.
Just saying that phrase out loud, expropriation without compensation, sounds utterly terrifying if you own a home, a farm, or a business anywhere in the world.
Hersov describes it as a literal sword of Damocles hanging by a thread over the entire economy. It is a legal framework that would theoretically allow the government to seize private property, whether that is agricultural land, commercial real estate, or corporate assets, without paying the owner a single cent for it if the state deems the seizure is in the public interest to correct historical racial imbalances.
That would destroy investment overnight.
Hersov points out that if you sat down and tried to design a policy specifically to terrify foreign direct investment and instantly destroy domestic property rights, this is exactly what you would invent. He mentions that he is personally involved in developing major real estate projects in the Western Cape, and he has to live with the daily theoretical reality that the government could simply walk in, change the locks, and take it all.
Which perfectly encapsulates the agonizing, contradictory duality of the source material we've unpacked today. We have spent this deep dive exploring a deeply polarizing, fiercely argued worldview of South Africa. On one hand, through Hersov's lens, we see a nation characterized by terrifying violence, a completely hollowed-out state apparatus, and political rhetoric that openly flirts with racial incitement and asset seizure. It is a place where the physical infrastructure is crumbling under the weight of systemic corruption.
Yet simultaneously, within the exact same breath, he describes a country of immense physical beauty, staggering financial opportunity for those willing to navigate the chaos, and most importantly, populated by deeply historically resilient people.
Yeah.
Whether you look at the legacy of Afrikaner mutual aid, the modern multiracial neighborhood watches defending against orchestrated riots, or the sheer audacity of entrepreneurs turning dead, rusted power plants into global AI hubs.
Yeah.
There is an undeniable, powerful life force persisting in the shadow of a very complex, very bloody history.
It is a country operating on multiple, violently clashing frequencies all at once. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to chew on. Something that builds on the mechanics we've discussed today, but stretches far beyond the borders of South Africa.
It really does have global implications.
It absolutely does. At the very end of his interview, Hersov makes a desperate geopolitical plea. He claims that fixing South Africa is the absolute entry point into Africa for the West. He argues that Western foreign policies have essentially ignored the continent and that Washington and London need to wake up immediately.
Right.
So here is your final thought. We're living in a century where global superpowers, the United States, China, Russia, are aggressively competing for influence, critical minerals, and strategic trade routes across the African continent. If the West continues to not give a damn, as Hersov claims, who fills that geopolitical vacuum? If South Africa, which has historically been the economic and logistical engine of the entire continent, sees its internal stability completely collapse under the weight of state capture and political fracture, does it just isolate the nation? Or does that collapse send shockwaves that redraw the entire geopolitical map of the global South?
When you calculate the strategic value of their deep water ports, their vast mineral wealth, and the sheer volume of human capital, a failing South Africa isn't just a localized tragedy. It represents a massive tectonic shift in global power dynamics.
Exactly. Diagnosing a broken bone is simple. Diagnosing the systemic collapse and the fierce, chaotic potential rebirth of a nation at the tip of Africa is incredibly murky. It is dark, it is controversial, and it is endlessly complicated. But looking at the stakes, it is a reality the rest of the world simply cannot afford to ignore. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, keep looking for the mechanics beneath the surface of the headlines, and we will catch you on the next one.